the lowest Iron Age. Then the Bronze Age was considered the age of the hero, when man is starting to wake up and, begin to realize who he really is.
Mm.
And then the Silver Age he called the age of the demigods. And this isn't something like the movies say, where a human mates with a god. It's actually where a human starts to realize he's a god.
Mm.
And then the highest age, of course, they call it the age of the gods. And, many cultures talk about these different epochs and this way that consciousness changes, including, Christ himself, who he was quoting the Old Testament when he said, "Is it not written that ye are gods? These things that I do, ye shall do also, and greater things."
Right. Yeah.
This is a guy you can believe, I think. And so it's talked about in virtually every culture, and I think we can understand the material age because, that's what we're in. We're just barely coming out of it now. When we begin to, the Indians, we say we begin to discover finer forces, is what they call it. And sure enough, and this was written thousands of years ago, and sure enough, as we start to come out of the Renaissance, what do we discover? We discover electricity and magnetism, and we realize that everything's made out of molecules, and molecules are made out of atoms, and atoms, seem to be made out of almost nothing. And matter of fact, string theory would say it's just, vibrating energy.
Yeah.
And so we are indeed beginning to discover that this universe around us that we had thought is so darn material, so darn heavy, is indeed, made of energy, and we have much greater possibilities, which we're beginning to express through our technology, but in the higher ages we express in far more eloquent ways.
So where would you suggest that we are on the scale? Are we approaching into the Silver Age maybe, or are we already there? What do you think?
No, we're just barely out of the Dark Ages. So if you draw a clock, say with 24 hours, and from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock you have you go down, and at 6 o'clock at the very bottom. So I'm just using a 12-hour system here.
Sure.
6 o'clock at the bottom, that would be the Dark Age, so that relates to about 500 AD. 498 is what some of the texts say. We're just barely about 6:30 a.m. We're on our way up, but we've just barely crossed the darkest point of the Dark Ages. And then 12 o'clock up there last occurred in 11,500 BC.
Mm.
And, will next occur in, another 10,500 years from now. So what is that? 12,500 AD.
Sheesh. Well.
Let me give you just, say, one marker along the way so you can kind of relate to it a little bit.
Mm.
If you go back to, say, about 3000 BC, when we're just beginning to build the first ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the first pyramids in Egypt, this sort of thing. And we find myth and folklore there that, writing is just beginning. And some of the first writing talks about a time when mankind spoke with one tongue, when the earth lived in peace and harmony. Hesiod talks about these things, but there's biblical mentions of these things. And we tend to dismiss it as, that's just myth. And then, when we're building the towers, God confuses the tongues. And so, the world, a few thousand years, falls into chaos.
Mm.
Supposedly, now go forward to about 4100 AD. It's when we go into the next higher age, into the Silver Age, as you mentioned. The saints and the sages that write about this and understand these cycles say that once again, man will have a universal knowledge of clairvoyance and telepathy.
Hmm.
like they did in a pre-Babel age. So it's indicative that you can see that, if any of these myths are true, then we really did have just a whole different way of living, a whole different way of communicating. And, we're sort of muddling through the darker ages now, just coming out, and in another few thousand years from now, we'll have a whole different way of living, a whole different way of looking at things.
Really interesting. Do you think that the fall that's mentioned in the Bible could be another analogy? Obviously, it's more of a slow descent than if we follow this 12-year, the clock version of this that you mentioned. But do you think that it's related to that, that we're falling out of grace, so to speak? We're becoming something else than what we have been previously?
Yes, exactly. I think this whole all this mythology about a fall, and there's a wonderful book written by Steve Taylor called The Fall. I hope you can have him on your show someday. He's in England.
Mm-hmm.
But he really details about much of the mythology, and he would say that we're sort of going from where we're kind of very connected, almost an animal instinct sort of sense, but of a high character, to where we go into ego consciousness, very disconnected, my, me, mine, very material oriented culture. And then slowly we begin to realize, hey, we're all part of one organism, and you kind of get it back together again. But yes, I do think that all these mythological references to a fall refer to that, and one that I really love reading about is the Babylonian references.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with an author by the name of Stephen Mall by any chance?
Don't recognize the name. No.
Okay, he's another guy you might want to have on the show someday. He's the foremost Assyrianologist in the world.
Mm-hmm.
He won the Leibniz Prize. He's read more cuneiform tablets than anybody out there. And, there's hundreds of thousands of these tablets, probably millions more broken up in the desert, turned to dust. But and when he says read, he takes the term very lightly. He says, we really don't understand these cultures, but we can make out some of the terms and kind of interpret it through our own eyes. And what he's noticed is that about 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, throughout Babylon, there, Mesopotamia, the Akkadian culture is very much aware that they're in a declining age. They're looking back at the golden age, trying to preserve as much as they can. Matter of fact, they practice archaeology, and when they find a structure that's 3,000 to 5,000 years old to them, they try to preserve it in such a way that they, quote, don't change it by an eyelash, end quote. So they see something almost sacred in ancient things, and they're trying to preserve it. And yet all their writings talk about, they're lamenting the days ahead. And Stephen Mall, he's actually a great etymologist. He, studies the language, and he's made an amazing discovery and found that the words that the ancients had for the past have become our words for the future.
Mm.
And their words for the future have become our words for the past.
How about that?
Yeah, and what the point here is that we seem to orient ourselves in time based on where we are in reference to the Golden Age. So for them, the Golden Age was closer, it was in the not-too-distant past, and they knew they were declining and fearing the Dark Age they were going to go into. And so they considered themselves, if you will, sort of going into the past or going backwards. And whereas us, we've seen the Dark Ages. Just 500 years ago, every nation was at war with one another. And if you go back 1,000 years, lifespans are half what they are. Plagues are ravaging the world, every dukie in every county is at war with one another. We don't want to go backwards 1,000 years. We want to go forward, and therefore we have these different terms for things.
That's a really, really, really interesting way of looking at it. And